Welcome. Really nice to see an almost full room, and I suspect that some more people may filter in if past is prologue here. We are really lucky to have Dan Arvizu, the director of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, with us here today. Many of you know Dan, and certainly I'm sure all of you know of Dan's work. I'm going to give a bit of an introduction here and try to kind of frame what, at least to me, seems like an interesting way to spend 40 minutes or so talking. And we're going to leave plenty of time for all of you to ask questions and throw out comments, because that's really, to me, I think the most fun of this is to get a conversation going. So we're going to err on the side of less talk up here and more interaction with you guys. And if you don't have anything to say, if we've totally bored you after 40 or 45 minutes, then we will just fill the time with more discussion up here, but I hope that's not the case. My name is Jeff Ball, and I've been at Stanford for about 3 years. I'm scholar in residence at a center at the business and law schools called the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance. Let me just tell you a bit about Dan. The format of this is a little unconventional for energy seminars, but we've done a couple of these in the past where we have a sort of discussion, and it seems to have worked well, so that's what we're going to do here. Very informal, and we're going to try to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time and hopefully pique your interest. So I'm going to tell you a couple of things about Dan by way of introduction initially that are on Dan's official bio, and then we'll have some fun. So Dan has been director of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, just outside of Denver since 2005. The lab goes by the acronym NREL, and it is the Department of Energy's main laboratory for research and development in energy efficiency and renewable energy. Those 10 years, effectively almost 10 years that Dan has led the National Renewable Energy Laboratory are a pretty extraordinary decade in terms of energy globally, right? Let's just review really quickly some of the things that have shifted in the past 10 years. China has surpassed the United States as the world's largest energy consumer and the world's largest carbon emitter. There's been a dramatic escalation in production of oil and natural gas in the United States as a result of shale development. In fact, the United States, by the estimate of the International Energy Agency, will exceed Saudi Arabia this year to become the world's largest oil producer. And at the same time, and we're going to talk a lot about this with Dan today, this has a lot to do with the work that his lab has done. There's been a dramatic reduction in the cost of renewable energy, particularly solar. So those are the lines that are moving in different directions, but all of those have occurred during Dan's tenure, and we'll see if Dan takes responsibility for it or the internet or
well,
something
the good
else.
Stuff, I will, yeah.
In addition, Dan is on a number of boards. He's on the board of State Farm as well, insurance, the insurance company. It's interesting. And for the purposes of today, Dan has really close Stanford ties. So Dan got his master's at Stanford. Dan got his PhD in mechanical engineering at Stanford. Dan is on the board of the Precourt Institute for Energy. In fact, he's playing hooky from the Precourt Institute's meeting today to be with us right now. So that's what's on the official bio. Let me tell you a couple of things that aren't on the official bio. My wife and I have the pleasure of being what are called resident fellows in one of the large dormitories here at Stanford, a place called Robley Hall. And it's a lot of fun, and one of the reasons that it's fun is that we get to have really interesting people over to meet with students. And we had Dan over for dinner last night to meet with about 10 students and just have a kind of a conversation. And I learned a couple of things that I thought you might be interested in, and here they are. Number one, Dan is the son of Mexican immigrants to the US and is the first person in his family, at least extended family, to go to college, let alone to get a PhD at Stanford. Dan started working with solar energy better than 40 years ago in 1975, and as Dan said last night, and I'm sure he'll tell us today, he's seen a bunch of cycles, ups and downs of interest in this stuff, and we're going to get into why. And the other thing I wanted to mention that he told us last night is that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Dan regards himself not as someone who, at least these days, is doing science, but he's someone who is managing the people who are doing science and communicating about the people who are doing the science. So I think Dan's view is that those are just as important as actually sitting in the lab and doing the science, and we're going to talk about why that is in kind of a political sense as well. All right, enough of a wind-up. I'll tell you lastly that Dan was in Singapore the week before last. Dan gets a lot of frequent flyer points. He is flying tomorrow to Washington, and he's going to have dinner with Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz tomorrow night, and then be in an all-day meeting on Wednesday with the Secretary of Energy. So from here to even more influential surroundings. What I want to do in this discussion is basically pierce the hype about renewable energy, because the other thing that's really helpful about Dan is that he's a straight talker. I think it's fair to say that on one side of the aisle, the rhetoric is that renewable energy is a silver bullet. And on the other side of the aisle, the rhetoric is that renewable energy is a charade. And my sense is the truth is somewhere in the middle. And my sense is that that's your sense too. And we're going to talk about that. Okay, so away we go. Here's what I want to start with. So you've been working on renewable energy for 40 years or 39 years. And you said last night that you've seen these cycles. Open this up for us by giving us a bit of context about how you see renewable energy fitting into the broader energy pie. And then you also told us last night that when you're on Capitol Hill testifying, you get two basic questions. How real is renewable energy and how big can it get? So answer those.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. And overly generous introduction. Thanks for dinner last night.
You bet.
With Tell Becky. It was wonderful.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the conversation with students was delightful. I learned from those experiences, and so it's always great to be back on campus. And this feels like home to me. So I feel like it's a homecoming. Let me just get to the questions real quick. I know we've got a limited amount of time. Lots of stuff to cover. The first thing I'll say is where we are relative to the cycles that I've seen in the past is I think we've got past the tipping point. I think there is now a place where we have a fairly significant amount of renewable energy deployment. $2 trillion has been invested over the last decade globally. 560 gigawatts, which is a big number of deployment, again globally, about 10% of that in the US. So now when I get a chance to talk to members of Congress, elected officials, when I get asked the question, when is this stuff going to be real? I can say without any reservations, it's real today, it's happening now, and there's plenty of evidence to support that. The second question, which is much more interesting, which is, and how much can we expect that we can ever get? And I thought about that a long time, but now I'm quite convinced that the right answer to this is I turn the question around and I say, how much do you want? Because there is no technical constraint or limitation. There is plenty of resources, and in fact, there's plenty of technology that will allow us to get a large fraction of our energy from renewable resources if done properly over the course of a lot of time. And we've done a number of studies at NREL. I know there's some studies going on here at Stanford that relate to the way in which we can advise states on how they might be able to accomplish a very high level of penetration of renewables. Albeit the fact is that right now, well, that's the potential. The actual truth is that we still have a very limited amount of renewable energy in terms of significance of our energy mix.
So just walk us through, paint that pie chart for us. So you cited the number, the capacity numbers for renewables globally, but what does that mean compared to other energy sources?
So I'll just start with global consumption. Global consumption, I think that's given in exajoules these days, 500 exajoules or something like that. About 20% of that is considered renewable, except that 10% of that 20%, or half of that 20%, is actually what we call non-traditional or traditional biomass, which really is not sustainable. So there's a 10% of modern renewables that's kind of consumption-wise. In terms of the electricity global, which is roughly 10 to 12% of the overall energy demand, so that's like 61 exajoules, but of that 22% is renewable energy. Of that, 16 of the 22 is hydro, and the balance of it, 6% globally, of non-hydro renewables is for electricity production.
So roughly of the total pie for electricity, 6% is what the people in this room would think about as renewable energy. And of total energy, not electricity, roughly 10%.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. So whether that's big or small is a function of how you think about these things, but still I think we should establish that it is a small slice of the total pie.
So just as an example, solar energy provides less than 1% of that electricity.
Right. Okay. So you said at the outset that you think we're at a tipping point. You've seen a lot of cycles, and you think that that something's different this time. Let me just push back against that for a minute. So there has clearly been a lot of technological development in renewable energy over the last 10 years. The price of solar, as many people in this room know, has come down precipitously. And yet, there have been some changes in the other direction really recently, right? We're all paying a lot less for gasoline than we were 6 months ago as a result of the fact that global oil prices are a lot lower than they were a few months ago. Natural gas prices may be a little higher than they were a year ago, but they are a lot lower than they were 10 years ago. And I think it's probably fair to say that politically not a lot of people think there's going to be a price on carbon, at least in this country, anytime soon. So, what makes you so sure that all of those trends aren't going to hurt renewables, that renewables aren't going to fall back again?
Well, there's a number of dynamics that are in place, and I think if you really talk about the energy environment, you have to understand a few of the key elements of this particular sector. So, first of all, energy prices in the U.S. versus Europe versus Asia are very different, and for different reasons. And so you need to kind of understand why those differences actually occur. And then the next thing you have to understand is what are the public policies that are driving things, and then ultimately how do we make the transformation that's needed. So let me just back up and say in the U.S. we've had public policy around energy literally for 100 plus years. And it was developed on the premise that, first of all, cheap energy was a good thing for economic development, and it would help fuel our kind of the Industrial Revolution, which it did. It was also based on the premise that fossil fuels were abundant, and they would always be so, and inexpensive, and we didn't really have any real concern about their environmental impacts. Okay, so that's the premise. That's the way in which we started, and so we heavily subsidized our energy infrastructure for 100 years. And here we are now in 2015, and we're at the point where the premise that we started with is no longer accurate. All of these things, it's not abundant, it's certainly, it's volatile in price, and certainly not environmentally friendly necessarily. So all of those things have conspired in a new way, so all of a sudden the question is, what do we do for the future? And so national policies have been formed around a transformation of that energy system to a one that's much more sustainable for the future and can lead us into essentially to the next century. Every region of the world is looking at this problem differently. And so in Europe you see lots of essentially public policy that drives prices up and demands a certain amount of decarbonization, and that has fueled their way of approaching
This
energy.
is why gasoline costs $10 a gallon in Europe and $3 a gallon here.
Yeah,
it's taxes, right?
and if you want to go and buy an automobile, you're going to get taxed at almost 100% of what the car is worth, just because they want to essentially constrain your willingness to drive.
Right.
You find the same sorts of things in Asia and other places. So there is public policy that's driving. So this sector, the energy sector, is highly regulated and so not classic supply and demand. So economics, like you normally see in normal world and other sectors, is not necessarily operative in this particular sector. And that differentiates it and why there's a role for government. There's always been a role for government, and we need to examine those policies. So ultimately, we've subsidized what we've got now, and now we're looking at making a transformation, and there are those who say that some of these alternative fuels, in fact, are important, and we subsidize those. So in this very distorted marketplace, some would argue, and this is the kind of the good and the bad and the ugly part of our business, is some would argue that we're competitive today. Well, we're competitive today in a distorted market. I mean, that's the bottom line. So if we want to be competitive tomorrow in a market that's not distorted, we've got to do a lot of things differently. And it's in that context that we're having all these discussions and all this confusion about, have we done enough, and who's ready to go to the marketplace. And that is different in the U.S. than it is different in Europe, and then it's different in Asia.
And we're going to get, in a few minutes, we're going to talk about politics, particularly about the midterm elections and the effect that may or may not have on any of this. But before we do that, I want to go back to the tipping point argument.
Okay.
Why do you think that it's different this time? In other words, let's go back when you started your career. You started your career effectively 2 years after the Arab oil embargo. Right. There was a resurgence of interest, a massive increase of interest in all the stuff that you now work in. And then in 1981, oil prices cratered and it all went away, right? Mm-hmm. So why is it not going to all go away now?
Well, there's several different reasons. I remember the first cycle. It was pretty euphoric because all of a sudden, President Carter said, we've got to do something very, very different than what we're doing. And the oil embargo was affecting all Americans and standing in lines. I remember I was a student at Stanford, and I remember having to kind of get up in the morning, drive your car, get in line, and wait until essentially the gasoline pumps opened at 8 o'clock, and I was there at 5 in order to get gas just to drive. And I rode my bike most of the time, so that was only for my wife to drive, not for me to drive. But all that to say, the president said, let's go do something different. We did. And it was really interesting, all of the first tranche of players that came into the market was Exxon and Chevron and Mobil and Shell and Arco and Boeing and McDonnell and Douglas and all of these aerospace companies and oil companies. And they came in, and we've still got pieces. When I was working at Sandia at the time, I'd gone from Bell Labs to Sandia Labs to start the solar programs before SERI/NREL ever existed. And it was exciting because there was all this money coming into the sector. All right. Then oil prices came down. We had a new administration. All of those players got out. They said, okay, that's enough of that. We're not doing that again. So they all got out. The next cycle, we had a lot of entrepreneurial startups, but the market wasn't ready for them, and most of them went away. Okay, and then the next cycle, the same sort of thing. So we're in a cycle now, though, that I'm much more optimistic about, that it's got some staying power, and there's been a lot of triage in the marketplace for sure after the recession. But what's
put less politely, a lot of people have lost their shirts and gone out of business.
No question. And I hear from the financial community that there's always a herd mentality. So there's a bubble. If you haven't seen the bubble yet, it's going to happen, and then it'll burst, and then you'll have this falling out that occurs. And that's happened this last time. What's different this time, though, is that you have, for instance, the European Union, in particular Germany. Germany put in something on the order of $20 billion to actually subsidize and create a market, which they did. They were all in on
You're talking about solar particularly.
And they had the solar in particular, and they had a feed-in tariff that was 65 euro cents a kilowatt hour, when the actual cost of energy was on the order of 25 or 30 cents a kilowatt
hour. So this is a subsidy to defray the additional cost of solar power against a market where conventional energy was a lot less expensive.
So that created a market. All right. So the next thing that happened was that Asia looked at this, in particular China, and China went, so many years later, China went all in on scale up to address those markets. And they put in probably $100 billion. So the next thing you know, now you've got massive scale up, you've got incredible amount of manufacturing going on, and the price is really coming down. Now the markets are still distorted based on this original construct that we have, but we've got now technology that's starting to enter the marketplace in a way that can compete in this somewhat distorted market.
Okay, so maybe tell me if this is fair, but it seems to me that one thing you're saying is that scale is different. There's a scale that was not the case a couple of decades ago, and as a result of that scale, there are entrenched interests in favor of renewable energy who are big, who didn't exist a couple of decades ago.
Right. So to do the scale up that's necessary, you need the entire value chain to actually, the supply chain to actually get created. And they've created those. So we've got all of a sudden now a lot of mouths to feed, lots of, this is job creation. There's a lot of things that rely on the sector being healthy. And again, I've talked to my colleagues in Germany over the years. I say, well, why did you just move in this direction? They moved in this direction primarily because of reunification. They had East Germany that was, for the most part, after West Germany and East Germany unified, was uncompetitive. 70% of the industry was unable to compete on its own in the open marketplace because prior to that had been subsidized. So the German government decided, what do I need to spend on a German job? And they created this as an instrument, and that was what drove public policy. Chinese had a different reason for doing what they were doing, but ultimately we're in a point now where we've got this marketplace, and it's fragile. But I believe that innovation has been spurred to the point that the next generation is going to be very competitive on a basis that is much closer to being non-subsidized than they are today.
Okay, that's fascinating. All right, let's shift gears here and talk about technology. And I want to, I want, at the risk of sounding like a downer, I want to talk not about what's going right in your view, but about what needs to happen that isn't happening. So let's take as a predicate here that there's been massive technological improvement in all of the kinds of technologies that NREL works on. Solar and many kinds of solar, wind, all sorts of other renewable energy technologies. What is the stumbling block? And yet, despite all those technologies, renewable energy is, as you already said, a small slice of the pie. What needs to happen technologically in a couple of minutes? What needs to happen technologically in order to really blow the doors off this and allow renewable energy to get as big as some people here at Stanford contend it could be, some people at NREL contend it could be?
There's a couple of kind of major barriers. First of all, I think in this country, our public policy is predicated on the fact that we are very good at crisis management. We are not very good at preventive medicine. In a bunch of different contexts, and you understand what I'm saying. And the problem that we have is with an abundance of natural gas at a price that's pretty attractive and pretty compelling, and we're very competitive on the world marketplace, there is no burning platform. There is, climate change is kind of out there, and somewhere in the next 20, 30, some years, bad things are going to happen, but tomorrow I get up and I go to work and things are pretty much the same.
Suddenly the energy security argument for renewable energy has gone out the window.
So all of a sudden, we're kind of comfortable, we've got this thing, and certainly we know the infrastructure is aging, we know security, competitiveness is kind of driving everything right now because we're kind of in austerity mode, we've got budget issues. High on my list, I look at what is public policy in this country, and energy doesn't show up. And if it does show up, energy is, we're going to put in the Keystone Pipeline. That's energy here in the country and in the country's ethos. So there is not much attention to this longer term, what do we need to do today to be prepared for the time when, in fact, this whole set of dynamics, it changes in a way that simply requires that we do some things differently, and that's where this lack of a burning platform is kind of the major barrier. In addition to that, of course, we just simply have other government priorities. Let me
just ask you another question though. If let's say that the political switch were switched, and suddenly there was, for whatever reason, a general consensus in this country that this country needed to go big into renewable energy, big in a way that it's not. Yeah. What would be the technological impediments at this point to doing that?
Yeah, so I think that the most near-term and effective use of renewable energy is in the distributed resources mode. So where I think what we have today in our, I'll just kind of focus on the electricity system, but it's also true in the transport system. But we have essentially centralized power with essentially central generation, big wires connecting that central generation, and then down to the distribution network, and then we supply energy to the consumer. The utilities would like to say, hey, what we're going to need is big power plant type solar, wind, geothermal, biofuel type or biomass kind of technologies. There's another model out there, and that model is this distributed gen part. And this is where I think there's great opportunity, but great resistance. And the great opportunity is if you generate energy at the point of use, you get to bypass all the inefficiencies of generating that power in a central station mode and delivering out to the end user. The economics are different. If I look at what I pay on my electricity bill, it's quite a bit higher than what the energy costs going into the utility. If I generate energy competing with what I pay on my utility bill, I have a different set of economics than I do if I'm going to put it in central station. All right, so two different business models in terms of where you might have a compelling value proposition or business case. Now, in order to enable distributed resources, distributed generation at the point of use, you need some things to happen. You need two-way power flow. You need to be able to measure and monitor and control things in ways that you've never been able to do that before. You need a smart system. You need an intelligent system. Now, I don't think anyone argues that in the future we won't need an intelligent system. But today we don't have an intelligent system, and it's kind of working okay. And so we're going to clunk along until that time comes that we absolutely have to replace it. The problem is that if we want to accelerate the use of these distributed resources and overall improve carbon footprint, in my opinion, you can improve reliability, you can improve cost effectiveness, you can open up the opportunity for innovation. All of that happens when disgen meets central station. And in the U.S., that's a particular point. In different countries, that'll be at a different point.
And what is the technological question there? That sounds like an economic and a political question, because clearly it's going to create new winners and losers economically, but what's the technological challenge?
The challenges are actually quite profound. And so we have relatively a dumb system, okay? So what you need is a smart system, a system that you can control variable load as well as variable generation. You can actually match those up so that you don't have these instabilities. When you generate, rooftop solar, what you have is opportunity for a variety of frequency and voltage, anomalies that the system was not prepared to handle because of the way it was designed. So there is plenty of technology, power electronics, a variety of what I'm going to call data analytics, which is smart everything that you can take the data, you can measure it, you can monitor it, and you can control things with it. That level of intelligence is going to drive a renaissance and innovation. But you got to have a business model where that actually is something that all stakeholders would like to see happen. The business model we have today doesn't allow that. There's a huge resistance because there's incumbent technologies and players whose essentially business model gets turned on its head.
So let's talk about that for a quick second. So there are pitch battles going on as we speak where about precisely what you're talking about. There are battles in Hawaii where the penetration of solar has become huge, and the electricity operator in Hawaii, which NREL has worked with, has essentially said, whoa, no more hookups or not as many hookups for a while we take a breather. There are big battles going on in Arizona over a term that many of you may know, net metering. That is essentially to what extent are homeowners who have solar panels on their roofs going to be able to sell it back into the system. So here's the question I have for you. When all of the dust settles on this, who's going to be on top? Are the Arizona public utilities of the world, are the Hawaii electric companies of the world going to figure out a way to sort of get ahead of this curve, and are today's dominant companies going to still be the dominant companies, or are they going to be companies we've never heard of, or little Silicon Valley players who are going to get huge and the big guys are going to be toppled?
If I knew the answer to that question, I'd start making bets now and hopefully get.
Although the federal government won't let you make those
that's
bets,
right. I'd get out of government and make the bets. So that's a great question, because actually no one knows. I mean, the fact is that this is an opportunity that we need to capture, but in order to capture it, lots of things have to change, and lots of stakeholders have to be part of this discussion. So in fact, we have a relationship with HECO, the Hawaii Electric Company, and Solar City, who's trying to put product in there, and they've actually got a somewhat of an unholy alliance working together, because in fact, as you suggested, HECO has said, if you're on a feeder and your feeder is already going to have 120% more solar on the system than the minimum load that we see, you can't add anything to it. And they essentially said, no more rooftop solar until we get this question answered, because that creates a condition of over voltage and potentially bad things can happen. So we started looking at what can we do to resolve that? And in fact, what we did is we started looking at a bunch of inverter technologies. Inverters actually can manage that system, because what HECO was relying on was the fact that this is the equipment I've got now. So what happens with my equipment that I have now? And what we were able to determine, and got some relief on this, was that the new technologies, in fact technologies that are pretty much commercial now, just not required in the system, can actually handle that system, and all of a sudden you don't have the bad condition that they were concerned about. And so we've done the testing, we've done the evaluation, and we've looked at all the various inverters, and they've released that particular problem.
To be clear, and forgive me if this is what stuff you already know, I just want to make sure everyone kind of understands that we're on the same page here. The stuff that they were concerned about was that at certain times of day when the sun is shining particularly brightly, there would be such an influx of electricity on the system
going
that
the
it
other
would overload the system effectively. And then at times when the sun's not shining, there would be a plummeting of electricity, and you couldn't deal with that variability in a system that was built to burn diesel power and have essentially a steady state of electricity provided.
So both of those were issues. The real issue was that when you have these over voltage kinds of conditions, things begin to shut down, and the self-protection part of the system actually creates a major problem that you simply can't deal with. So the issue here, though, is that the technology actually exists. The utility just didn't really understand it or have access to it or require it in order for them to solve the problem with distributed generation. So the moral of the story here is that we've got state policies that are driving the deployment of technology that is changing the nature of this system no matter what else we do from a federal policy standpoint. And that's why I think the tipping point is actually occurring now, is because we've got homeowners now kind of used to the fact that they can be their own consumer and own producer of energy, and they kind of like that. And now it's a question of how much right are you going to give that customer to be a producer as well as a consumer? And I think these are issues that regulators are dealing with. And as time goes on, that's where the battles are being fought, is at the Public Utility Commission. And next week I will be with the chairman of the Colorado Public Utility, who is looking at this issue from a very, very, I think, objective standpoint. And he's invited commissioners from other states that are doing experiments in their states so that we can do a lessons learned and say, what can we do in Colorado based on what everyone else is doing? So it's kind of an experimental lab thing going on at the various state levels, all around net energy metering, value of solar, and those kinds of things.
Okay. Let me ask you two other things, and then we're going to finish up in about 5 minutes and open it up, or maybe 10 minutes and open it up to you guys. So you are also, in addition, because you have so much time on your hands, you are chairman of the National Science Board. And this is really significant for the purposes of this discussion. So the National Science Board is the board that governs the National Science Foundation. And I know that there are some Stanford faculty members in this room, and I dare say there are some people in this room who are recipients of National Science Foundation grants. So one of the things that Dan's going to be doing when he's in Washington over the next couple of weeks is chairing a meeting of the National Science Board. So I have a couple of questions for you about this. One is, how do you assess where the U.S. is on technological innovation compared to where the U.S. was 20 years ago? And how do you assess where the U.S. is today compared to where other countries are today?
Great question, and one for which I have a little bit of experience in communicating, primarily because one of the roles that the National Science Board does is they, every other year, according to the public statute that requires the board to exist, is to publish the science and engineering indicators. And so we do that every other year. 2014 report came out. As the chair, I get a chance to go brief the White House. I brief the Senate, the House, and the media. And so a couple of takeaways from where we are, because it's precisely to the point that you just asked. So where is the U.S. relative to R&D expenditures? So we spend $400 billion a year on R&D. And it's still twice as much as the next largest country that does that, which is China. And they spend roughly half of that, for $200 billion. Interesting enough, over the course of the last 20 years, the mix of how much of that R&D was funded by the government versus the private sector has switched. It used to be 70%, and now it's funded by the government, and now it's 30% funded by the government, and declining, which is very alarming.
It's alarming. Why?
It's alarming primarily because there is no other entity that actually funds basic research. So if you look at the basic research that goes on at universities and in some other research labs, something like 90% of that comes from the public sector.
So your concern is that if the funding shifts from the government to companies, that at some point the U.S. is going to lose its edge because the kind of research that gets done is not going to be the cutting edge of basic research?
So as you might expect, the government funds more basic work, the industry funds more applied, closer to the marketplace kind of stuff, and that is in fact really important. And I'll come back to that here in a second. Now, one alarming piece of the trends is that by the year 2022, China will be outspending us in total R&D. Okay, so the trajectories are like this, right? And in 2022, if everything continues on the same, just extrapolate out, China will spend more on a volume basis than the U.S. Okay, in terms of R&D. So that's important. Another piece of this which is really important, which is the other piece that I focused on when I brief these things, is a thing called the KTI. So the knowledge and technology intensive industries. And it's really amazing because the technology and the KTIs actually represent something on the order of 15% of our overall workforce. So we have 134 million jobs in this country. 15% of that is in the KTI space, and yet that sector of our economy generates 40% of our GDP. Okay? If you look at high technology manufacturing, which is even a smaller piece of KTI, of which clean tech is a piece, that piece there actually not only is, it's only 1% of our overall job creation, but it actually is something like 25% of our GDP. All right. Now here's the more interesting part. Of that high-tech manufacturing piece, segment of our economy, it is actually responsible for 1/2 of the private sector R&D, which is really alarming if we neglect that sector. That sector is where the private sector money is. That's the 70% of our R&D spend. So unless that piece is being highly leveraged, we really have an issue that relates to competitiveness. And that all is, it's part of that ecosystem of science and technology. Those are the kinds of things that we're focused on at the board, to try to figure out how do we preserve that part of the U.S. competitive infrastructure, which is innovation and creativity and all the things that support our public and private universities, without a budget that is prioritized in the sense of spending the money that's necessary on STEM, both research and education.
I think it's fair to say that the general assumption is that the U.S. has led the world in energy technology innovation, at least historically. Is that still going to be the case? Are you confident that that's the case? Let me ask it more specifically. As you look at a world map, what's happening outside the U.S. that, good or bad, from wherever you sit, that's interesting? Yeah. How is that changing? So
a couple things. First of all, we still have the most elite university system in the world. It is still the envy of the world. And if you look at our elite universities, of which Stanford is one, MIT and Caltech and some others, you look at those and you say, wow, they're still a big draw. They're still highly competitive. They're doing great. But as you get down into the public universities, and especially into the community colleges, our ecosystem of education is deteriorating rapidly. Another topic of another science board companion piece to these SEIs, the science and engineering indicators, which is the lack of investment into public research universities.
And what do you see happening outside the U.S.?
Outside the U.S., what you see is a lot more attention to focused on KTIs in that sector of the economies. Those economies in emerging economies used to be 10%, now they're 20%, growing to 30%. They're getting bigger. In my own business, which is renewable energy, and I spend a lot of time thinking about what others do and that kind of stuff, what I can see is where we used to be the insular kind of head and shoulders research prowess of the world, we are no longer that. There are now pockets of technology in other universities, in other research institutions, in other parts of the world that are beginning to rival what we do. And so I would be first to say we're still number one in the class in terms of our elite status of research. However, that gap is closing, and it's closing fairly rapidly.
Let me ask you one other thing, and then we'll open it up for everyone. So we just had a midterm election a couple days ago, which was pretty momentous politically. And in the context of the subject that we're talking about, I think it's fair to say that people on both sides of the aisle expect big ramifications from this midterm election. And whether one thinks that those changes are necessary or problematic is purely a function of where you sit. But what I want to ask you is, do you agree? Do you think that your world is about to be rocked by what happened last Tuesday? Or do you think that this tipping point that you've talked about is such that it's sort of beyond the vicissitudes of midterm elections?
Well, that's a loaded question, and I probably could
Is
find
it?
a lot.
Really? I didn't mean it to be.
I could find a lot of ways to get in trouble if this thing gets recorded. Let me say this. I think I really don't think there's any kind of watershed event that has just happened. I believe that most of the activity that we've seen, it's been going on literally for more than a few years now. Most of the activity that we see in terms of progress along the lines of the transformation of our energy system, which is the thing I focus on, is happening at the local level. It's grassroots. It's bottoms up. And where there is public policy, the PTC and the ITC, those are
production tax credit and investment tax credit. These are subsidies for renewables. Yeah.
Where those are federal policies, kinds of things, and the government to some degree enables. Most of the activity that you see is because there is local, regional economic development interest to push things, and because you have pockets of support for particular types of investments for.
So the motivation is not partisan; it's regional and economic, is what you're saying.
It's very regional, and there's no question about that. And it changes from one side of the country to the other side of the country, and as well as outside of the U.S. So there's all these incredibly complex dynamics that are occurring, and so it's as I can frequently say, it's very complicated, and you need to kind of look in and ask a lot of very specific questions about very specific regions and or technologies to get any kind of clarity around what really is happening out there. So I don't see the political drivers. There is a couple that I think is important. First of all, I think we got bipartisan support for R&D. So I think everybody recognizes R&D is an important thing, and we need to do that. I also think we have bipartisan support for infrastructure development. Now, for different reasons. I think the conservatives would say, hey, we need natural gas pipelines, we need Keystone Pipeline, we need that. There's also the grid modernization thing that I talked about earlier, and that's something that more accommodates a decarbonization of our electricity system. I think there's some common ground there where there can be some synergy where if the politicians really want to get something done before the next cycle, that there's space to talk. And I believe, certainly efficiencies on everybody's productivity improvement, that's on everybody's radar. So there's a lot of things that can be done if the political system had the will to do it. But even in the absence of that, I think they'll continue to see progress, primarily because I see technology moving quickly. Very smart investors, not the herd mentality investors, but the very judicious ones that are saying, I'm going to pick out these very specific things. They're going to find niches that they can exploit and make some return on investment.
Okay, I don't think you should actually yourself into trouble in that one. So,
okay,
well done. Okay, so we have a little more than 15 minutes, and I hope that we've touched on some things that you find interesting enough to ask about, or maybe we haven't touched on things that you want to talk about. Who wants to? I want to actually give precedence here to students. So, who is a student? Who has not been asleep?
We're all students. Yeah.
We're all students, and I mean students in the literal sense. Who's a Stanford student who wants to pipe in with a question or a comment or criticism or whatever? This is not a good sign. Please go ahead.
First, thank you very much for a really interesting conversation. My question is about the role of government in creating markets. You mentioned the kind of high technology manufacturing. It's a large portion of our GDP, a large portion of our private R&D spend. What's the role of government in creating marketplaces for the products that those companies are creating? And what's sort of the best policy approach for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Everybody here, the question has to do with the role of government in creating markets and the facilitation of those markets. So that's a topic of great interest, and it's a topic of great interest, really in all of the conversations that I have on essentially in Congress and in administration. So we've got these things called tech to market and those kinds of things. As our discretionary budget gets reduced because of all the other things that are in the budget, there's more and more scrutiny, and there's more and more attention to both return on investment and so that has led to a conversation over the last few years since the recession on how do you create jobs? Well, how does this relate to competitiveness and job creation? That's kind of the center point of most of the discussions these days. And so that gives us a little latitude to start thinking about where is it that the government has a role. Now, I always make the argument, once again, I've done it today, which is the energy sector is a highly regulated sector. Therefore, government has a role. They already play a role. Whether you like it or not, whether you want to admit it or not, they play a role. So let's at least get past that. And then the question is, you keep hearing all the rhetoric about, industrial policy, picking winners and losers. You hear all that rhetoric that suggests that there's some sort of bad intent regarding the government's investment. I haven't heard a congressman or senator yet who has said anything that when you create jobs that they're going to criticize. So job creation is kind of a touch point that everybody likes to see. So what's the role? The proper role really has to do with, certainly from the perspective of the DOE National Labs, we are not to compete with industry. We are to enable in lots of different ways, and we're to do things that we used to call pre-competitive, generic technologies. There's platforms on which you build, and there's certain things that you can do that enable these marketplaces. And so, there's essentially a spectrum of ways in which you can contribute into this, innovation tech to market stuff. We like to call it, there's this acronym we use, TRL, Technology Readiness Levels. And so the basic research, those are technology readiness levels 1, 2, 3, and then all the way out to 7, 8, 9, which is kind of very commercial. And so we like to stay in that spectrum where we're helping industry, because they're going to be on the later TRLs, the government's going to be on the earlier TRLs, and sometimes there's reasons why in the middle nothing will happen unless there's a government market or a government facilitation. So as an example, we have building technology, efficiency technologies and renewable energy integration for net zero energy buildings. So we have a relationship with the Army. And we are looking at 9 different Army installations where the Army wants to go to a complete net zero energy installation. And we've given them essentially the benefits of what we've learned in our research and those kinds of things so that they can actually go deploy that because they have kind of a captive market. And it helps them not because they want to be green, but it helps them because they want to be energy efficient and they want to save money and they want to be responsible, right? So all of those things are in a positive way, and they're willing to take a few pilots and do a few things that allow that marketplace to create things that ultimately can be transferred into the private sector. So there's multiple roles in which the government can get involved, and we try to find the ways to get the most highly leveraged way of spending government resources.
Any other students? Excellent. Right in the blue shirt, please.
Yes. I'd like to ask your views on the net energy metering issue. It doesn't seem to be completely fair to the utility when a customer is able to offset kilowatt hour for kilowatt hour based on their own solar generation when they're getting a lot of benefits like getting power at night and getting support from the grid. What are your thoughts on this? And should the tariff model move to more of a subscription charge for having a hookup to the grid?
So I want to define terms here because this may not be necessary, but I want to just take moderator's privilege here. So, Dan talked about a centralized model where a power company sells power to you, the homeowner. So this question is about what happens if you put solar panels on your roof and you start generating more power than you need, and you therefore can sell power back to the grid, or you're buying less. To what extent should you be paying the company for the maintenance of those wires that you need when you can't produce everything you need or you want to sell it back? And this is the sort of brass knuckles fight that's happening in many places around the country.
So there's this big, kind of polarized discussion that's going on out there. So let me just kind of, in fact, so the chairman of the Public Utility Commission in Colorado asked me that very question. So here's kind of the answer I gave him. The answer I gave him was, first of all, look, the subsidy tools and mechanisms that we put into place. Germany used the feed-in tariff. We use the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is a mandate. We've used production tax credits, which is essentially a tax law sort of approach. All of these instruments are imperfect, and net energy metering is one of those instruments that's imperfect. It was very valuable to start a solar industry and to have. It was just a convenient way to start putting distributed generation onto a utility grid, in fact, because you could just run the meter backwards and it's just the net that you were actually going to charge for. I mean, as a starter kit, that was a good instrument. It is a very blunt instrument, and it really doesn't do what you want it to do. So lots of states have been starting to experiment with other approaches. Let me get back situated here. With other approaches, which is called the value of solar. And so there's a bunch of new mechanisms that are doing that. But even those are, to a large degree, blunt instruments. All right? What is necessary here is to rethink what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And so what I told, so our chairman says, so Dan, which of these policies are the best mechanisms to resolve this conflict between the solar folks who want more and the utilities who say this is not fair, and it's actually cost shifting to the people, the rate payers that don't have solar on their roofs, right? That seems inherently unfair. So the question was asked, so which way do we divide the baby? So my response to that was, the answer, so obviously you're the Public Utility Commissioner, you're going to get a chance to make that policy call, but let me just offer you this. You will make a policy decision based on what you think the future looks like. If the future looks like I've got central station power and I'm going to make incremental changes to that, I'm going to make one set of policy decisions. If the future is I'm going to change the way we do business and the consumer gets to be a prosumer, a producer and a consumer, and be able to manage electrons, then I'm going to have a different set of policy positions that I'll take and put in place to get us to a new energy future. And that new energy future is one that is based on energy services. If the utility is spending money to create an infrastructure that is your safety net as a homeowner where you're generating most of your electricity, but when you need electricity, you need electricity, right? You want to have access to it, then you ought to pay a premium for that. There ought to be a pricing schedule based on the value of the services that you're providing in the system. And that changes the role of a utility from an electron provider into an energy services provider. That's the new model. And the utility regulators are at ground zero. They get to make this call one way or the other. But if their future is we're going to keep doing what we're doing and we're going to make incremental changes, they'll go one way. If they are convinced and persuaded by the research and the things that we're doing in the R&D area that this is a new environment that you can take advantage of, which in fact I think you're seeing in some cases like Hawaii and California, then you'll get a different set of policy decisions. And that really is the crux of the issue. And so it's not so much about is NAM bad or VOS bad, net energy metering, value of solar. What future do you want? And if you want this other future, let's start putting in place the policy mechanisms that allow us to get there more quickly.
There was another question over there. Yeah, please.
Oftentimes we hear natural gas and renewable energy cast as conflicting, as opponents to one another.
Yeah.
Recent studies out of NREL and JICEA have talked about the complementaries of natural gas and renewable energy. From natural gas fuel price volatility to intermittency renewables. So can you comment a little bit on whether or not there's a broader shift taking place? I've seen articles that say even the natural gas folks want to cast their fuel as being complementary with renewables. Do you see that as a narrative that is beginning to proliferate at large, or are they going to continue to be opponents to one another?
Yeah, so my colleagues at Bloomberg like to call gas and renewables as frenemies, not friends, not enemies, frenemies, and I kind of subscribe to that. That debate will find an equilibrium. I'm totally comfortable with the idea that these two can coexist in a way that's very synergistic. Again, I'm back to distributed generation meets central station. You can natural gas, especially combustion turbines, can do the ramping that's necessary to firm up all of the intermittency that relates to the non-hydro renewables. And I think for the most part, that equilibrium will it'll seek its own level depending on a variety of conditions, regionally dependent on resources and public policy and the cost of energy and what the consumer can demand and all those things, right? So I think that is the discussion that we're going. You know, the more progressive folks on the natural gas side believe that this is a very viable future, and it's an okay thing to do, and we're collaborating with them in a lot of different ways. Interesting enough, we've got a partnership with with San Diego Gas company, and it's very interesting. They have a bunch of renewables on their system, primarily because of the public policy in California, and what they're asking us to do is to look at, so we've got this excess energy both in solar and wind when we don't have load. And rather than curtail it, rather than throw it away or not use it, we would rather store it. How can we do that? So there's a bunch of variety of things that they can do, one of which is, of course, pump storage, or you can do batteries, you know, flywheels and compressed air. But one of the things that's very interesting to me is that what they want to do is they want to convert this excess energy through hydrolyzer to hydrogen, add CO2, make methane, put it into the natural gas system. And that becomes a storage of renewable energy that is very compatible with their infrastructure.
So let me interrupt. There are people shaking their heads, and I haven't. So no, but I know what you're going to say. But before, so why should they not be shaking their heads?
Yeah.
I'm a Stanford engineer. And I'm from New Jersey.
That's all it is.
First, you're an employee of us as a federal employee, right? When you go back to NREL, could you please do something like the VA head, the new VA head has done, to reorganize the place? And tell them not to quote capacity, nameplate numbers like you did with the 560 gigawatt nameplate capacity for all the wind and solar. That is not real. That's not real power. And you know it.
Yeah.
I know it. Every engineer in this place knows it. But the renewables people have been pumping that stuff out for so long they've discredited themselves. And I don't want to see a federal employee, you, or a federal agency, NREL, continue to do that. So I would appreciate you putting a memo out when you get back there that says to everybody, no more nameplate quotes to the press. You give them what the Germans have found out, 9% or less solar capacity factor. That means 9% of the time they get some juice, or less than 19% for wind. Less than 19% of the time do they get juice from wind.
Well, I'll give you the right numbers, because those are not the right numbers.
No, it came out from the Germans themselves.
Yeah,
So now,
but in the U.S. they're much higher.
And
than
my
that.
other question.
Could you
Perhaps.
repeat the question, please? Or the
Yeah, I think this was an admonishment to not use capacity.
There needs
All
to
right.
be.
So
That's the first part, and I don't care to have you answer now. I don't
Okay.
care.
But he gets a chance to answer it. Real
Go
quickly.
ahead. Finish your
My
point.
question is, you avoided carefully, apparently, nuclear. Geothermal you mentioned. Geothermal is nuclear. Stanford is a very anti-nuclear place for an intellectual
Not
location
everywhere.
on the planet,
Yeah.
an elite one. Quote, why is NREL so negligent about nuclear? The Chinese are passing us by. The Russians are passing us by. The Czechs are passing us by. Every country in the world is building an infrastructure and an educational system and engineering capability and so forth that is surpassing us.
Okay, so
Nuclear. And President Kennedy in 1962 set up a plan to eliminate combustion by 2000.
so listen, we have 2 minutes, and I want you. Answer.
I need to answer that, yeah.
Answer the nuclear question, though, and then we're going to have one other
All
question.
right, so the Department of Energy has 3 national labs that are energy applied labs. There is NREL, that's the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Lab. There's NETL, which is the Fossil Energy Lab, and there's INL, the Idaho National Lab, that is a nuclear lab. Right. We are all of the above. All of those technologies have a place. In the infrastructure that I'm talking about, I'm saying the transformation that needs to occur is technology agnostic. And all I need is to know is what are the attributes of that energy system of the future, and if nuclear can play a part, so be it. I'm happy. It's a home run, all right? But they've got to play their part. They've got to play their part in terms of waste management. They've got to play their part in terms of cost, and they've got to play their part in terms of CO2 reductions. That's not to say they can't. And the same with fossil. I'm technology agnostic. However, what I can say is the renewable community can do a lot more in this future energy mix than anybody gives them credit for. And I think in this context, let's have an open, objective dialogue as to how that can actually occur. Because frankly, I think we're all wanting the same thing. We would like to have a future energy system that is competitive and allows us to be low cost and all of those things that I think we all aspire to. But let's define that endpoint in terms of attributes, not in terms of technology push. So
no, I'm gonna, sir,
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Right.
break the rules here, and one person who has the question that we have to hear before we leave the room. Mark.
Most of the conversation is about the United States. Most of the threat to the climate is from the developing world. What's the role of U.S. government and U.S. institutions in trying to help the developing world maintain economic growth, but minimize the negative impact on the environment if they continue to rely on fossil fuels?
Well, and that's obviously a question that we've struggled with for many years and we will continue to struggle with. So 95% of the new energy demand will come from emerging economies. Very clear right now that that's Asia. Then right after that it'll be South America and then Africa and the others. So there's a lot of parts of the world that still have to come up to the same standard of living that we have. And of course, their argument is, I'm going to put in the cheapest stuff that I can primarily because I need to feed my folks. And we're going to try to do what we need to do. Most of that's going to be very carbon intensive, and we recognize that. So the opportunity really is to lead the way. The opportunity is for us to do the decarbonization of our system and to begin to demonstrate on the basis of the value proposition and the head-to-head cost compelling cost value proposition that says this is the best choice. And if you can do that, then these other emerging economies choose the best stuff. They're not going to go with the stuff that's not the most economically favorable, because it is about economics primarily for emerging economies. So part of what we do is to share on the international stage with those. And in fact, this message about distributed generation has got traction. It's got traction in the emerging economies primarily because they don't have the resources to put in huge infrastructure for central station. They can put in a lot of distributed generation, very modest, very different than what we do, but very relevant and important for what they do. And so it's in the context of this international collaboration that we spend a lot of time saying, what are you doing? How are you doing it? The price of energy in other parts of the world is incredibly different than it is here. In Europe, it's 2x, 3x what it is here, and in Asia, even more so. Right? So even natural gas is very challenging in Asia. They don't have the technology development that we've had for the last 20, 30 years that has given us essentially, shale gas at a very inexpensive rate. So part of what we need to do is really international collaboration. Energy is a global commodity and global issue, even though it's got its regional differences, and it's differentiated in a lot of different ways. I think the future really lies in our ability to innovate and apply that innovation to get rid of all of the inefficiencies in our system. Our system today literally is 60% inefficient, and that really is where the opportunity is. And I think that's where the real discussions and debates ought to go. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Dan.
Thank you.